April 2011. In the folds of the Blue Ridge foothills, the quiet was wrong. It was a silence where a sound should have been, the absence of a hum that had defined spring in the valley for generations. The apple orchard stood in full, glorious bloom, a sea of white and pale pink blossoms under a soft Carolina sky, but they were nearly empty. A few wild bumblebees, heavy and slow, drifted from flower to flower, but the honeybees, the millions of them that were supposed to be there, were missing. Alara Vance felt the silence more than she heard it. It was a pressure in the air, a hollowness in the world. She stood at the edge of her property, a mere 70 acres of mixed woods and pasture that her grandfather had bought in 1948. From her vantage point on the ridge, she could see the vast, manicured rows of the Abernathy and Gilliam orchards, their trees pruned into perfect commercial shapes. They were beautiful and they were dying. She was 28 years old, but the valley still saw her as the child who had trailed after old Silas Vance, her grandfather. They saw the quiet girl who had taken over the old farm after he passed, the one who kept to herself and did things the old way. They called her methods quaint, her equipment antiquated. They saw her small, scattered apiary not as a serious operation, but as a hobby, a young woman's sentimental tribute to a dead man's peculiar notions. The problem had started the previous autumn. A warm, wet September had weakened the hives going into winter. Then came the mites, a new and vicious strain of Varroa destructor that treatments barely touched. A brutally cold snap in January was followed by a false spring in late February, tricking the colonies into early brood production. When a hard frost returned in mid-March, it killed the new brood and a generation of foraging bees, leaving the hives crippled just as the first nectar flows began. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm that had wiped out nearly every commercial hive in the county. This was the crisis. The apple trees, representing millions of dollars in revenue for the valley, needed pollination within a 2-week window. Without the bees, the blossoms would wither, the fruit would not set, and the year's crop would be a total loss. It was an agricultural emergency on a scale no one had seen before. For 50 years, the valley had not worried. There had been wild bees, and dozens of small farmers like her grandfather had kept their own hives. The landscape was a patchwork of fields, forests, and fallow lands, providing a continuous bloom from March to October. But over the last 2 decades, things had changed. Farms consolidated. Hedgerows were torn out for more planting space. Monoculture became the rule. The wild bees dwindled, and the small beekeepers sold their land or gave up. The big orchards, now covering thousands of acres, became dependent on rented hives, trucked in by the flatbed load from Florida and Georgia each spring. This year, the trucks had arrived with boxes full of dead and dying bees. The valley's farmers had tried to solve this before. A decade ago, after a smaller scare, the county extension office had launched a program to encourage local beekeeping. They had offered grants for modern Langstroth hives, Italian queen bees, and the latest chemical treatments. It had failed. The imported bees were not adapted to the local climate. The uniform hives were perfect breeding grounds for disease, and the reliance on chemicals seemed only to breed stronger pests. The community had accepted the problem as permanent, a cost of modern farming. The solution was not to fix the local ecology, but to rent more bees from somewhere else. Now, somewhere else had no bees to rent. Into this crisis walked Richard Thorne. He was a regional manager for Pollinate Corp., the largest apiary logistics company on the East Coast. He arrived in a clean white pickup truck with the company logo on the door, a stark contrast to the mud-spattered farm trucks of the valley. He was in his early 40s with a confident smile, a crisp polo shirt, and a tablet computer he was never without. He represented the new system, the one that promised efficiency and predictability through data and chemistry. Thorne called a meeting at the county co-op. The room was packed with anxious orchard owners, their faces etched with worry. He stood at the front, a slideshow presentation projected on the wall behind him. He spoke with the easy authority of a man who believed his spreadsheets held the answers to the world's problems. He began with an assessment. What you're facing here, he said, his voice calm and reassuring, is a classic cascade failure. It's a combination of Varroa pressure, Nosema ceranae, and what we broadly term colony collapse disorder, exacerbated by a volatile weather pattern. He used the terms with a clinical detachment that made the dying of millions of creatures sound like a minor logistical snag. He presented charts showing mite counts, spore loads, and temperature deviations. His solution was a multi-year recovery contract with Pollinate Corp. For a substantial fee, they would provide new colonies for the following year. These were bees from their proprietary breeding program in California, queens selected for honey production and docility. The contract included a mandatory regimen of their own patented protein patties, sugar syrup fortified with vitamins, and a new, aggressive miticide called Mite Guard Plus. We can't save this year's crop, he concluded. It's too late for that. But we can ensure this never happens again. We need to move past outdated, sentimental notions of beekeeping and embrace a scientific, systems-based approach. During the question and answer session, old Mr. Abernathy, whose land bordered the Vance farm, stood up. "My father, an old man Vance," he said, his voice raspy with age. "They never had these problems. Silas, he kept his bees in logs and weird-looking boxes. Never fed them, never treated them. And he always had bees, more than enough for his own apple trees and half of mine." Thorne gave a patient, condescending smile. "I appreciate that, sir, and I have the utmost respect for the old-timers. But we're dealing with modern problems. Global pests, climate instability. Folk remedies and backyard tinkering won't solve systemic issue. The scale is different now. We need scalable solutions, and that means standardization and proactive chemical management." From the back of the room, Alara watched him. She had not spoken. She had just listened. Thorne's eyes swept across the crowd and met hers for a moment. He saw a young woman in worn work pants and a faded flannel shirt. He saw the dirt under her fingernails. He gave her a brief, dismissive nod, a gesture of pity for someone so clearly out of her depth, and then turned his attention back to the men who signed the checks. He had dismissed her, and with her, the entire history of the valley she carried in her memory. The talk at the feed store in the days that followed was all about Thorne's proposal. The consensus was that it was expensive, but they had no other choice. They were businessmen, and this was the business of modern agriculture. They talked about Alara, too. Heard she's still messing with those old bee gums of her granddaddies, one farmer said, leaning against a sack of fertilizer. "Sweet girl, but she's playing with toys while the rest of us are about to lose our farms," another laughed. "Maybe she can pollinate her half-acre of clover with them." "It's a shame. Silas was a good man, but he filled her head with a lot of nonsense that doesn't work in the real world." The community's reaction reinforced her isolation. They saw her as a relic, a keeper of a dead faith. They did not see the knowledge behind her silence. They did not understand that what they called nonsense was a system of thought far older and more resilient than Thorne spreadsheets. They pitted her for clinging to the past, unaware that the past was about to become their only future. Alara left the co-op meeting without a word to anyone. She walked home along the dirt track that separated her land from the Abernathy orchard. The perfect, uniform rows of apple trees on his side were a stark contrast to the wild tangle of her fence row, thick with blackberry, honeysuckle, and wild plum. His land was neat, efficient, and silent. Hers was messy, chaotic, and beginning to hum with life. She went directly to her bees. Her apiary was not in one place. It was scattered across her 70 acres in small clusters of 2 or 3 hives. Some were in the open pasture, some tucked into the edge of the woods, some halfway up the ridge. The hives themselves were a strange collection. There were a few Langstroth boxes, the standard white rectangles of modern beekeeping, but most were different. There were long, horizontal top bar hive her grandfather had designed, and her favorites, the bee gums. These were sections of hollow black gum trees, sourced from her own woods, with a simple wooden top and bottom. To an outsider, they looked primitive, like something from a museum exhibit. She approached a set of 3 gums near the creek. The air around them was thick with bees, their bodies golden in the afternoon sun. The sound, The hum the rest of the valley was missing was a deep, resonant chord here. She stood and listened, her eyes closed. This was the sound of health. Her mind drifted back. She was 10 years old, standing in this same spot with her grandfather. Silas was a tall, lean man with hands that looked like they were carved from old oak. He was showing her how to read a hive without opening it. "You listen first, Elara," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "A happy hive has a steady hum, a busy sound. A hungry hive has a high, whining pitch. A queenless hive has a roar, a sound of panic. You can hear their troubles before you ever lift the lid." He was her mentor. He had not taught her beekeeping from a book. He had taught it as a language, a way of seeing the world. He had come home from a war in 1945 with a quiet in his soul, and had found its remedy in the woods and fields of this small farm. He had learned from the bees, and what he learned, he passed to her. His core principle, the idea that Thorn and the others could never grasp, was simple. Silas had articulated it one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the ridge. "Everybody thinks they keep bees," he'd said. "They buy a box, a queen, and a bag of sugar, and they think they're a beekeeper. But you can't keep a bee. You can't fence them in. They go where they need to go. The hive isn't the box, Elara. The hive is the valley. You don't keep bees. You keep the land that keeps the bees." This was the hidden knowledge. It was not a secret technique or a magic formula. It was a complete shift in perspective. Thorn and Pollinate Corp saw the hive as a production unit, a box to be managed for maximum output. Silas saw the box as a simple dwelling, a single node in a vast, interconnected web of life that was the actual colony. The health of the bees did not come from a bottle of chemicals or a patty of artificial protein. It came from the health of the 1,000 acres of forest and field they foraged. It came from the diversity of pollen and nectar from 100 different species of plants, each providing a different nutrient, a different medicinal compound. It came from clean water in the creek. It came from the resin of pine and poplar trees, which the bees used to make propolis, a potent antimicrobial substance that sterilized the hive. The physical manifestation of this knowledge rested on a shelf in her grandfather's old workshop. It was a series of 12 ledger books, their covers worn soft with use. They were his bee journals, one for each year from 1970 until the year he died. They were not records of honey production or mite counts. They were diaries of the valley. Inside, his neat, cursive hand documented the world. April 10th, 1974. Red maples finished. Poplar starting to yield. Saw the first blackberry blossom today. Bees are bringing in pale yellow pollen. Queen in hive number 4 is laying a beautiful, tight pattern. He had sketched the flowers, noted the direction of the wind, recorded the dates of the first and last frosts. Flipping through the worn pages, Elara found the entry she was looking for in a journal from 1978. That year, a pesticide spraying for gypsy moths had decimated the local pollinators. It was a different cause, but the result was the same, a silent spring. In the margins, Silas had written his plan. He had not bought new bees. He had taken his few surviving colonies, split them into tiny nucleus hives, and hidden them deep in the woods, far from the sprayed areas, near stands of sourwood and wild persimmon. He had let them rebuild slowly, on their own terms, on the land's terms. By the next year, his hives were booming again, while others who had bought replacement bees from out of state lost them all again the following winter. The journal entry ended with a simple, powerful sentence that served as his thesis. The solution is not in the hive, it is in the landscape. The bees know how to survive. My job is to make sure they have the country they need to do it in. That night, Elara made her decision. She would not argue with Thorn. She would not try to convince the men at the co-op. Words were useless against the tide of their fear and their faith in modern systems. She would act. She would take what her grandfather had taught her, the deep, site-specific knowledge of this small piece of earth, and she would prepare her bees. She would not just help them survive. She would make them the valley salvation. She would do this quietly. Her tools were not the shiny, stainless steel implements from the beekeeping catalogs. Her main hive tool was an old putty knife, ground down and shaped by her grandfather's hand. Her smoker was a dented BBQ brand model from the 1960s, its leather bellows soft and pliable from decades of use. She fueled it not with store-bought pellets, but with a mixture of dried pine needles, rotten punk wood from a fallen oak, and a handful of dried mullein leaves, a combination Silas had sworn calmed the bees better than anything else. She did not wear a full, white bee suit. She wore her usual work clothes, a pair of loose-fitting canvas pants, and a long-sleeve shirt. On her head was her grandfather's old pith helmet, its brim stained with sweat and propolis, a bee veil tucked around it. She preferred to work without gloves, her hands bare. She believed it made her more careful, more attuned to the bee's mood. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and calm. The core of her work centered on the bee gums and top bar hives, designs that contrasted sharply with the standardized Langstroth boxes Thorne advocated. The Langstroth was designed for the beekeeper's convenience. Uniform, interchangeable frames made for easy inspection and honey extraction. But Silas had believed this convenience came at a cost to the bees. The thin wood and large open space made the hives difficult for the bees to thermoregulate, and the reusable frames could easily spread disease from one colony to another, year after year. Her grandfather's top bar hives were simple wooden troughs, wider at the top than the bottom, covered with plain wooden bars. The bees built their comb down from these bars naturally in the elegant catenary curve that was their instinct. There were no frames, no pre-stamped wax foundation. The bees built the cell size they needed for workers, drones, or honey, as the colony's logic dictated. The bee gums were even more radical in their simplicity. They were just hollow logs, about 4 feet tall and 18 inches in diameter. The walls were 3 inches of solid wood, providing insulation far superior to the 3/4-inch pine of a modern hive. Inside, the bees built their nest as they would in a wild tree, a complex, interconnected world of wax, honey, and brood. Alara could not easily inspect these colonies, but that was the point. Her grandfather believed that constant inspection, the tearing apart of the nest every 7 to 10 days as recommended by modern manuals, was a profound stress on the colony, making it more susceptible to disease. His method was to leave them alone, to trust them. The process began the next morning at dawn. It was not a single task, but 100 small ones, a slow and methodical application of her knowledge over the entire farm. First, she walked the land. This was her primary form of inspection. She followed the creek, noting the density of the jewelweed and the purple-flowered ironweed that would bloom in late summer. She walked the pastures, checking the spread of the white clover, a crucial source of spring nectar. She climbed the ridge to the stands of tulip poplar and black locust, their buds swelling, promising a massive nectar flow in the coming weeks. She was not just looking at plants. She was assessing her inventory. This was the bees' pantry, and she needed to know it was full. After her walk, she began the work with the hives. She started with her strongest colonies, the ones in the bee gums that had overwintered with exceptional success. She chose 3 of them, colonies whose bees displayed what she knew to be hygienic behavior. They were meticulous housekeepers, quickly removing any dead or diseased brood from the nest, a genetic trait that made them highly resistant to mites and other pathogens. These were her survivor stock, the genetic heart of her operation. From these colonies, she would make splits. It was a way of propagating the bees, of creating new colonies from the old. But her method was different from the commercial approach. A commercial beekeeper would split a hive in half, trying to create 2 large, productive colonies as quickly as possible. Alara's splits were tiny. She opened a top bar hive that was bursting with bees, the air filled with their hum and the sweet, warm scent of beeswax and honey. With gentle, precise movements, she lifted one of the top bars. The comb below was a perfect curtain of white wax, heavy with nectar and packed with pollen of a dozen different colors: yellow from the dandelions, orange from the henbit, pale green for the maple trees. She found the queen, a beautiful, dark bee, her abdomen elongated, moving calmly across the comb. She carefully selected 2 bars. One contained capped brood, developing bees sealed in their wax cells, and the other contained eggs and young larvae, along with stores of pollen and honey. She placed these two bars, and all the bees clinging to them, into a small wooden box called a nucleus hive, or nuke. This tiny new colony had no queen. But because it had fresh eggs, the worker bees would identify several of them and begin feeding them a special diet of royal jelly, raising a new queen of their own. This was a critical part of her grandfather's system. By letting the bees raise their own queen, she ensured the new colony would be headed by a queen born of this place, a queen from survivor stock, perfectly adapted to the valley's specific climate and forage. Commercial beekeepers bought queens by mail order, queens bred in Georgia or California for traits like honey production, but with no genetic connection to the place they were expected to thrive. To Silas, that was like trying to plant a palm tree in a snowstorm. She repeated this process all day, creating 12 small nucleus hives. It was slow, painstaking work. Each movement was deliberate. Each decision, which comb to take, how many bees to include, was based on years of observation. The math did not require a pencil. It was an intuitive calculus of population dynamics, resource availability, and the colony's spirit. As the sun began to set, she loaded the small nuke boxes onto the back of her grandfather's 1958 Alice Chalmers tractor. The old machine sputtered to life with a puff of blue smoke, its engine a familiar, comforting rhythm. She drove not to the open pasture, but into the woods. Using a map from her grandfather's journal, she placed each new hive in a carefully chosen location. One went into a small clearing on the north-facing slope, where it would be sheltered from the hot afternoon sun. Another went near a seep spring, ensuring a reliable water source. A third was placed in a dense stand of sourwood trees, which would provide the most prized nectar of the year in early summer. She was not creating an apiary. She was inoculating the landscape with bees. She was distributing them, decentralizing them, making them a resilient and integrated part of the forest, not a fragile collection of boxes in a field. The skeptics observed her work from a distance. Mr. Abernathy, tilling the field that bordered her woods, saw her disappear into the trees with the little boxes. He shook his head. It looked like a child playing house. What good could those tiny swarms do for his 100 acres of apples? Richard Thorne drove by her farm a few days later, on his way to sign a contract with the Gilliams. He saw her in the pasture, not with her bees, but on her hands and knees, planting something. He slowed his truck. She was seeding wildflowers. He saw bags of buckwheat, phacelia, and crimson clover. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. The valley was facing economic ruin, and this woman was planting flowers. It confirmed every prejudice he had about small, sentimental farmers. They were hobbyists, utterly disconnected from the realities of modern agriculture. He shook his head and drove on, his confidence in his own scientific, serious approach reaffirmed. He was saving an industry. She was gardening. For the next 2 weeks, Alara lived by the rhythm of the bees and the bloom. She cared for her new, small colonies. She didn't feed them sugar syrup, the universal crutch of modern beekeeping. Her grandfather had despised the practice. Feeding a bee sugar, he'd said, is like trying to raise a child on nothing but soda pop. It'll keep them alive, but it won't make them strong. Instead, she ensured they had access to what they needed. She had left her hives with ample stores of their own honey, and her planting was supplementing the wild forage, creating a rich and varied diet that would build strong immune systems. The first signs of success were subtle. It was not a dramatic event, but a slow, quiet unfolding. It began with the sound. One morning, a week after the apple blossoms had opened, Leo Abernathy, Mr. Abernathy's grandson, was fixing a fence on the line between their properties. He was 16, a quiet boy who was more interested in biology than farming. He stopped his work and listened. From his family's orchard, there was only the sound of the wind. The few pollinate corp hives they had rented, the ones that had survived the trip, sat inert, their entrances still. But from Alara's side of the fence, from the woods and the pasture, came a low, powerful hum. It was the sound of tens of thousands of wings. He looked up. The sky above Alara's land was alive with bees, flying in straight, determined lines from their hidden hives toward the apple blossoms. He watched as they descended on his family's trees, a river of pollinators flowing from her property onto his. The bees were small and dark, a mix of blacks, grays, and browns. They were not the uniform, golden Italian bees from the commercial hives. They were her bees, the valley's bees. That afternoon, Mr. Abernathy saw it for himself. He had spent the morning in his orchard, his heart sinking. The blooms were perfect, the weather was ideal, but there was no activity. He was calculating his losses, preparing for a year with no income. Then, walking the rows closest to the Vance farm, he noticed the change. The trees were humming. The blossoms were trembling with the work of thousands of bees. He walked to the edge of his property and looked over at Alara's land. He saw what his grandson had seen, a steady, directional stream of bees emerging from her woods and descending upon his trees. He stood there for a long time, his hands on his hips, a look of profound bewilderment on his face. He had known Silas Vance for 40 years. He had respected him, but had always thought his bee theories were a bit eccentric. Now, Silas's eccentricity was pollinating his orchard. It was saving his farm. He was forced into a moment of silent reevaluation, the confident certainties of a lifetime of modern farming beginning to crack. Richard Thorne got the news in a series of panic phone calls. His clients were reporting catastrophic failures. The hives he had placed in the Gilliam and Martin orchards were dead. Not weak, but completely dead, the bottom boards littered with bees. His Mite Guard Plus treatments had failed. The vitamin-fortified syrup had not strengthened them. His proprietary California Queens had not adapted. His entire system, the one he had sold with such unshakable confidence, had collapsed. He drove out to see for himself, his jaw tight with anger and denial. He passed the Abernathy orchard on his way. He expected to see the same sterile silence. Instead, he saw a sight so unbelievable he pulled his truck to the side of the road. The trees were swarming with bees. Not his bees, he knew that. His were gone. These were different. He got out of the truck and walked to the fence line, his tablet forgotten on the passenger seat. He watched for 20 minutes. The air was thick with them. He could see the pollen baskets on their legs, heavy with the pale white dust of the apple blossoms. He followed their flight paths back across the fence, back to the messy, inefficient-looking farm he had dismissed. They were coming from the woods, from the pasture, from the direction of the creek. They were coming from Alara Vance's land. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't a few bees from hobbyist hives. It was an army. He had brought in 500 hives on trucks, and they had failed. She had a handful of logs and wooden boxes, and she was providing a pollination service that dwarfed his entire corporate operation. The logic was inescapable. His system was wrong. She was right. The climax of the work was not a single moment, but the steady, relentless work of the bees over the next 10 days. They worked from dawn until dusk. Alara's small, scattered colonies, which had looked so insignificant, proved their strength. Because they were distributed, they could efficiently forage a much larger area. Because they were genetically adapted, they flew in cooler weather than the commercial bees, starting earlier in the morning and working later in the evening. Because they were healthy, they were tireless. The orchards nearest her farm, Abernathy's, and the lower block of the Gilliam's property, were thoroughly pollinated. The difference was so stark it was visible to the naked eye. On one side of a dirt road, the Gilliam trees were full of bees, their blossoms visited and fertilized. On the other side, farther from Alara's land, the trees stood silent, their blossoms beginning to fade and fall untouched. The success of her method was absolute and undeniable, written across the landscape itself. Months later, the success was quantified. The harvest came in late September. Mr. Abernathy reported a yield that was not just average, but exceptional. His Honeycrisp and Gala apples were larger, better formed, and more numerous than they had been in years. His official yield was 1,100 bushels per acre on the 100 acres closest to Alara's farm, a full 30% higher than the county average and infinitely higher than the 0 bushels harvested by the farmers who had relied solely on Pollinate Corp. The county extension agent, a careful, methodical man named David Chun, documented the results in his annual report. He recorded the total failure of Thorne's program, a 98% colony loss rate across the county. In a separate section, he documented the success of what he termed the Vance method. He had visited Alara with her quiet permission and had counted her colonies. From her original 20 overwintered hives, she had created 12 new ones. Her winter loss rate had been less than 5%. By the end of the summer, all 32 of her colonies were strong, healthy, and heavy with honey. The economic data was stark. Pollinate Corp had cost the Valley's farmers over $200,000 in rental fees for dead bees. Alara Vance had spent less than $50 on seeds for her pollinator pasture. The quiet, undeniable success of her method echoed through the community, dismantling the foundation of their skepticism. A week after the harvest numbers were published, Richard Thorne drove down Alara's long gravel driveway. He did not come in his white company truck. He came in a dusty, unmarked personal vehicle. He found her in the workshop, cleaning and storing her grandfather's old hand-cranked honey extractor. The air smelled of beeswax. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She moved with an unhurried grace, her hands cleaning the old machine with a practiced familiarity. She knew he was there, but she did not stop her work. She simply acknowledged his presence with a calm glance. He stepped inside. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, weary humility. He looked at the strange wooden hives stacked against the wall, at the shelves of old books, at the simple, functional order of the room. This was the headquarters of the operation that had professionally ruined him. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly, without preamble. Everything I said at that meeting, everything I believed about how this works, it was all wrong. I came here to tell you that. And to ask how, I looked at your setup. It defies all the metrics, all the models. My models say your bees should be dead. Instead, they save the valley. I don't understand. Alara finished wiping down a gear on the extractor. She set the cloth aside and turned to face him fully. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet stillness. She was not a victor enjoying a conquest. She was a teacher, waiting for the student to be ready for the lesson. She did not give him a lecture. She did not gloat. She simply gestured for him to follow her. She led him out of the workshop and into the pasture. She knelt down in the grass, which was a thick carpet of clover, plantain, and dozens of other low-growing plants. "You looked at my hives," she said, her voice soft. "But you were looking in the wrong place. The answer isn't in the box." She picked a stalk of crimson clover and held it out to him. "It starts here." She walked him through her farm, the way her grandfather had walked her through it 1,000 times. She showed him the deep-rooted chicory that brought up minerals from the subsoil, which then appeared in the nectar. She pointed out the resin beading on the bark of a pine tree. "That's their medicine," she explained. "They make propolis from it. It's an antibiotic, an antifungal, and antiviral. Your plastic hives and clean, smooth would give them no chance to build a proper propolis envelope. They live in a sterile environment, so their immune systems are weak." She led him to one of the bee gums. "This log has 3 inches of wood. It stays cool in the summer and warm in the winter. They use less energy just staying alive. The bees that came from my strongest stock, the ones that survived the winter here, they know about that late frost in March. Their genetics are timed to this place. They don't start raising a lot of brood too early. Your bees from California were tricked by the fall spring. Mine whited." Finally, she took him back to the workshop and opened one of her grandfather's journals. She showed him the entry from 1978, the one about the pesticide kill. Thorne read the careful cursive, the detailed observations, the simple conclusion. Alara summed up the core principle her grandfather had taught her, the lesson the journal contained. "The problem was never the mites, Mr. Thorne. The mites were just the symptom. The problem was weak bees in a sick landscape. You try to fix the symptom with chemicals. My grandfather taught me to fix the cause by healing the land. I don't keep bees. I keep the valley." Thorne was silent for a long time, the open journal resting in his hands. He was a man whose entire professional life was based on control, on systems, on managing nature. What he was seeing was a system based on trust, on partnership, on listening to nature. It was a complete paradigm shift, and in that moment he understood it. The knowledge changed him. A month later, he resigned from Pollinate Corp. He did not leave the valley. He sold his expensive house in the city and bought a small, neglected farm 10 miles from Alaris. He met with David Chun at the county extension office. He brought not a sales pitch, but a proposal. He wanted to start a new program, a cooperative for local beekeepers. He would use his knowledge of logistics and business to help them, but the foundation of the program would be what he now called advanced principles. It would promote raising locally adapted queen bees. It would subsidize the planting of native forage crops and pollinator-friendly cover crops. It would create a mentorship program where experienced keepers of sustainable hives could teach newcomers. He was taking his own expertise and systems and applying it not to impose a flawed model on the landscape, but to support and expand the resilient, decentralized model Alara had preserved. His proposal was approved unanimously. He had learned the lesson, and now he was helping to adopt that knowledge into the larger system. The enduring symbol of this change remained the old, weathered journals on Alara's workshop shelf. They were not relics of a forgotten past. They were living documents, the foundation of the valley's new, resilient future. Beside her grandfather's elegant script, Alara had begun to add her own notes in the margins, her own observations on bloom times and bee behavior. The book of knowledge was still being written. A new normal began to settle over the valley. The sight of a bee gum at the edge of a field was no longer a symbol of eccentricity. It was a sign of a healthy, forward-thinking farm. More and more orchardists began seeding their tractor rows with clover and vetch. The low hum of honeybees, once a seasonal visitor, became a permanent resident, a constant, reassuring presence from spring to fall. Alara's success was no longer a remarkable anomaly. It was simply the way things were now done. It had become the new, old conventional wisdom. Leo Abernathy became her apprentice. He spent 2 afternoons a week and every Saturday at her farm. He was a quiet, observant student. Alara taught him not just the mechanics of beekeeping, but the philosophy behind it. She taught him to identify plants, to read the weather, to listen to the hives. She saw in him the same patient curiosity she'd had as a child. One autumn afternoon, she found him sitting quietly by a top-bar hive, a notebook open on his lap. He was not inspecting the hive. He was just watching the bees return, their legs heavy with the dark, rich pollen of late-season goldenrod. In his notebook, he was not writing numbers. He was sketching the flower and making a note. October 5th, goldenrod is the last big flow. The bees are getting ready for winter. They sound calm and content. He was not just learning how to do the work. He was learning how to see the world. The knowledge was being passed on. The story of what happened that spring became a quiet local legend, a parable told at the co-op and the feed store. They no longer laughed at the memory of Silas Vance or his quiet granddaughter. They spoke of them with a deep and humbled respect. The lesson was that the newest, most expensive solution is not always the best one. Some forms of wisdom do not become obsolete. They're not based on technology or data, but on a deep understanding of a specific place. They are patient. They wait in old books, in the memories of the elders, and in the land itself, for people to remember why they were true.